when 30-year-old single father Alden Finch shared his last sandwich with a homeless woman outside his struggling auto shop in downtown Phoenix, he thought he was just showing basic human kindness. The woman, who called herself Mia, had been living in the alley behind his garage for weeks, and Alden couldn't bear watching her go hungry while his 8-year-old daughter Emma had plenty to eat upstairs. But what Alden didn't know was that Mia wasn't actually homeless. She was Mia Thornton, a 25-year-old real estate billionaire who had been secretly testing the compassion of business owners throughout the city. Her company had been quietly buying up properties in the neighborhood, and she wanted to see who deserved to stay and who deserved to go. That simple act of sharing lunch would lead to the most shocking revelation of Alden's life, and change both their destinies in ways neither could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Alden Finch noticed the woman sleeping in the alley behind his auto shop, it was during one of those brutally hot Phoenix summers that made even the desert lizards seek shade. She had appeared on a Tuesday morning in late July, curled up against the brick wall of the neighboring building, with nothing but a tattered blanket and a small backpack that looked like it had seen better decades. Most business owners in downtown Phoenix would have called the police immediately, viewing homeless individuals as nothing more than obstacles to commerce and potential liability issues. But Alden had learned long ago that life had a way of humbling everyone eventually, and he wasn't in the business of making anyone's existence more difficult than it already was. His auto shop, Finch Automotive Repair, occupied a narrow lot on East Van Buren Street, sandwiched between a struggling laundromat and a Mexican restaurant that somehow managed to stay busy despite its questionable health department ratings. The building itself was a testament to urban decay and stubborn persistence, its faded blue paint peeling in strips that revealed layers of previous color schemes, dating back decades. Alden had bought the property 3 years ago, with every dollar of his savings and a loan that kept him awake most nights, gambling everything on the belief that honest work and fair prices could still build a sustainable business in a city increasingly dominated by corporate chains and franchise operations. The shop barely generated enough revenue to cover rent, utilities, and the basic supplies needed to keep ancient vehicles running in the desert heat. Most of his customers were working-class families who couldn't afford dealership prices, people who understood that a reliable mechanic was worth more than a fancy waiting room with free coffee and magazines. Alden specialized in breathing new life into vehicles that other shops would have declared dead on arrival, finding creative solutions with salvaged parts and years of experience that had taught him to see potential where others saw only scrap metal. Above the shop, he had converted the second floor into a modest apartment where he lived with his 8-year-old daughter Emma, a bright and curious girl who had inherited her mother's quick wit and her father's stubborn determination to find good in every situation. The apartment was small but functional, with Emma's bedroom facing the street so she could watch the city wake up each morning, and Alden's room overlooking the alley where he could monitor his business even during off hours. The living space reflected their circumstances, furnished with second-hand items that Emma had helped him paint and arrange, creating a home that felt warm despite its obvious limitations. Emma's mother, Rebecca, had died in a motorcycle accident 2 years earlier, leaving Alden to navigate single parenthood while building a business that demanded 18-hour days and constant attention to detail. Rebecca had been the dreamer in their relationship, the one who convinced him to leave his steady job at a dealership and pursue his goal of owning an independent shop where he could work with his hands and build something meaningful. Her death had nearly destroyed him, not just emotionally but financially, as medical bills and funeral expenses had consumed most of their savings and forced him to take additional loans against the business. But Emma needed stability and hope, not a father drowning in grief and debt. So Alden had learned to compartmentalize his sorrow, focusing on the daily routine of repairs and maintenance that kept food on their table and a roof over their heads. He taught Emma basic automotive skills in the evenings, showing her how engines worked and why regular maintenance prevented expensive breakdowns, hoping to instill in her the same appreciation for honest work that his own father had passed down to him decades earlier. The homeless woman in the alley disrupted his carefully structured world in ways he didn't immediately recognize. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with long brown hair that she kept clean despite her circumstances, and clothes that were worn but not filthy. Unlike many of the homeless individuals who frequented the area, she didn't approach customers for money or food, didn't leave trash scattered around the property, and seemed to understand the invisible boundaries that separated public space from private business. She simply existed in that narrow alley, reading paperback books during the day, and disappearing somewhere unknown each evening before returning to the same spot by morning. Alden's first interaction with her came on a Thursday afternoon, when he was replacing the transmission in a 1998 Honda Civic that belonged to Maria Santos, a single mother who cleaned offices downtown and couldn't afford to miss work while her car was being repaired. He had promised Maria that he would have the vehicle ready by Friday morning, which meant working through lunch and probably well into the evening to meet his deadline. As he emerged from beneath the Honda, wiping transmission fluid from his hands with a rag that had seen better days, he noticed the woman watching him work with an expression of genuine interest rather than the vacant stare he associated with people struggling with addiction or mental illness. Their eyes met briefly, and she offered a small nod of acknowledgement before returning her attention to the book in her lap. There was something about that moment that stuck with him as he continued working, a sense that she understood the satisfaction that came from fixing something that had been broken, from taking a mechanical problem and applying knowledge and skill until it functioned properly again. Most people viewed auto repair as a necessary evil, a source of unexpected expenses and inconvenience. But this woman seemed to appreciate the craft involved, the patience and expertise required to diagnose problems and implement solutions. That evening, as Alden locked up the shop and prepared to head upstairs for dinner with Emma, he found himself wondering about the woman's story. Everyone ended up homeless for different reasons, and he had learned not to make assumptions about people's circumstances or choices. But there was something about her demeanor that suggested intelligence and education, qualities that made her presence in the alley more puzzling than threatening. She wasn't displaying the behaviors he associated with drug addiction or severe mental illness, wasn't talking to herself or engaging in the erratic actions that often characterize people living on the streets. The next morning, as he prepared to deliver Maria's Honda and collect payment that would cover Emma's school supplies for the upcoming semester, Alden made a decision that would change both their lives in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. He had packed 2 sandwiches for lunch, habit more than hunger, and as he walked past the alley on his way to test drive the repaired vehicle, he stopped beside the woman and extended one of the wrapped sandwiches toward her. She looked up from her book with surprise, studying his face as if trying to determine his motives before accepting the offered food. Her voice when she spoke carried an accent he couldn't quite place, educated and refined in a way that seemed inconsistent with her current circumstances. "Thank you," she said simply, unwrapping the sandwich with careful movements that suggested both hunger and dignity. "I'm Mia, Alden," he replied, gesturing toward the shop behind him. "I work on cars. If you need anything, water or use of the restroom, just let me know." That simple exchange, lasting less than 2 minutes, established a routine that would continue for the next several weeks as summer gradually gave way to the slightly more tolerable heat of early autumn in the desert. Alden Finch had never planned to become a single father running a struggling auto repair shop in one of Phoenix's transitioning neighborhoods, but life had a way of making plans irrelevant. At 30, he carried the weight of responsibility like a familiar tool, something he had grown accustomed to handling even when it felt heavier than he could manage. His days began before sunrise, checking overnight messages from customers whose vehicles had broken down and needed immediate attention, planning repair schedules that would maximize revenue while maintaining the quality standards that separated his work from the quick-fix operations that dominated the discount market. The shop itself reflected both his aspirations and limitations, organized with military precision, but equipped with tools that had been purchased second-hand and repaired multiple times. His father, a career Navy mechanic who had spent 20 years maintaining aircraft engines on carriers deployed around the world, had taught him that proper organization and tool maintenance were more important than having the newest equipment. Every wrench had its designated place, every diagnostic manual was filed according to make and model, and every repair bay was cleaned thoroughly at the end of each workday. These habits had been drilled into him during childhood afternoons spent in his father's garage, learning that respect for tools and workspace was really respect for the craft itself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But discipline and organization could only compensate for financial limitations to a certain extent. The hydraulic lift in Bay 2 had been acting up for months, requiring constant adjustment and occasional creative solutions that involved wooden blocks and careful positioning to maintain safety standards. The computerized diagnostic equipment was 3 generations behind current technology, forcing Alden to rely more heavily on experience and intuition than many modern mechanics who had learned to trust machines over instinct. His parts inventory was minimal, requiring daily trips to salvage yards and supplier warehouses to find components that would keep his repair estimates competitive. The apartment above the shop told a similar story of making the best of limited resources while maintaining dignity and hope. Emma's bedroom was painted bright yellow, a color she had chosen because it reminded her of sunshine, and decorated with artwork they had created together using supplies from the dollar store and materials salvaged from various projects. Her bed was positioned beneath the window so she could watch the street below, observing the rhythm of urban life that had become as familiar to her as the sound of air tools and engine noise from the shop below. Alden's own room was spartanly furnished but meticulously maintained, with clothes hung in order of use and personal items arranged with the same precision he brought to organizing his toolbox. On the nightstand beside his bed sat a framed photograph of Rebecca, taken during their last vacation together at Lake Pleasant, her smile capturing the optimism and energy that had convinced him to take the risks that led to business ownership. Next to the photograph lay a small notebook where he tracked daily expenses and revenue, a habit that had become both obsession and survival strategy as he navigated the constant challenge of keeping the business afloat. Emma had adapted to their circumstances with the resilience that children possessed when they felt secure in their parents' love and commitment. She understood that money was tight without feeling deprived, helped with simple tasks around the shop without being burdened with adult responsibilities, and maintained the kind of cheerful curiosity that reminded Alden why he worked so hard to provide stability in her life. Her after-school routine involved homework at the small desk in the shop's office, where she could complete assignments while staying close to her father and occasionally helping with simple tasks like organizing receipts or answering the phone when he was working beneath a vehicle. Their evening routine was sacred time, protected from the demands of business and financial pressure. Dinner was usually simple but nutritious, prepared together in their small kitchen, while Emma shared details about her day at school, and Alden described interesting repairs or challenging diagnostic problems he had solved. After dinner they would work on homework together, with Alden helping her understand mathematical concepts by relating them to practical problems like calculating gear ratios or determining fuel efficiency. Before bedtime, they would sit together on the small couch in their living room, reading books from the public library, or watching educational programs that expanded Emma's understanding of the world beyond their neighborhood. But beneath the surface of their stable routine, Alden carried burdens that he carefully concealed from his daughter. The business was struggling more than she knew, with several months of declining revenue that had forced him to defer maintenance on the building and postpone equipment upgrades that would improve efficiency and safety. His customer base was loyal but limited, consisting primarily of working-class families who were themselves struggling with economic pressures and often delayed repairs until their vehicles literally couldn't function. He had considered expanding services to include more profitable work like custom modifications or classic car restoration, but lacked both the specialized equipment and financial cushion needed to attract that type of clientele. The insurance settlement from Rebecca's death had covered immediate expenses and provided a temporary buffer, but those funds were nearly exhausted after 2 years of using them to supplement business income during slow periods. His credit was good but limited, and he had already borrowed against the business to cover emergency repairs and unexpected expenses that inevitably arose when operating on such narrow margins. The weight of financial pressure was constant, creating a background stress that affected his sleep and occasionally shortened his patience with difficult customers or challenging repairs. But Emma's presence in his life provided both motivation and perspective that kept him focused on long-term goals rather than daily frustrations. She represented not just his responsibility as a parent, but his connection to Rebecca's memory and their shared dream of building something meaningful together. Every successful repair, every satisfied customer, every small improvement to the shop or apartment felt like progress toward the stability and security that Rebecca had wanted for their family. Her death had been devastating, but it had also clarified his priorities in ways that made business challenges feel manageable rather than overwhelming. The neighborhood around the shop was changing, with gentrification slowly pushing longtime residents toward the periphery, while bringing new businesses and higher property values that created both opportunities and threats. Several auto repair shops had closed in recent years, unable to compete with chain operations or adapt to rising rents and changing demographics. But Alden believed that his reputation for honest work and fair prices would protect him from market pressures, that customers would continue choosing quality and personal service over convenience and corporate efficiency. His relationship with other business owners in the area was cordial but not close, built on mutual respect and occasional cooperation rather than deep friendship. The owner of the Mexican restaurant next door occasionally sent customers his way when they mentioned car problems, and Alden referred people to the laundromat when they needed to clean work clothes while waiting for repairs. But he maintained professional boundaries that prevented business relationships from becoming personal obligations, protecting both his time and emotional energy for the people who mattered most. This careful balance between openness and self-protection had served him well since Rebecca's death, allowing him to function effectively in his community while avoiding the kind of deep attachments that might distract him from his primary responsibilities as both father and business owner. He was friendly but not intimate, helpful but not vulnerable, present but not exposed to the kind of loss that had nearly destroyed him when Rebecca died. It was a sustainable approach to life that prioritized stability over excitement, security over adventure, and Emma's well-being over his own unfulfilled needs for companionship and emotional connection. The routine of sharing lunch with Mia developed gradually over the course of 3 weeks, evolving from a simple act of kindness into something that both Alden and Emma began to anticipate as a highlight of their day. What had started as an occasional gesture when he remembered to pack extra food became a daily practice that required planning and consideration, though Alden told himself it was just basic human decency, rather than any kind of meaningful relationship. Mia never asked for food or assistance, never positioned herself where she might interact with customers, and seemed to understand instinctively the boundaries that separated charity from business. Emma first noticed the woman during one of her after-school visits to the alley behind the shop, where she sometimes played with a stray cat that had taken up residence near the dumpster. Rather than being frightened or suspicious, Emma displayed the natural curiosity and acceptance that children possessed before they learned to judge people based on circumstances rather than character. She observed Mia reading books, noticed that she kept her small area clean and organized, and eventually mentioned to her father that the woman seemed lonely and might appreciate some company. Alden's protective instincts initially resisted Emma's suggestion that they invite Mia to join them for lunch, but his daughter's innocent logic proved difficult to argue against. If Mia was hungry enough to accept sandwiches, she probably didn't have regular access to hot meals or comfortable seating. If she was spending her days reading in an alley, she might enjoy conversation with people who shared her appreciation for books and learning. And if she was living alone on the streets, she might benefit from the kind of human connection that everyone needed for emotional well-being. The first time Mia accepted their invitation to eat lunch in the shop's small break room, Alden was struck by how naturally she seemed to fit into their routine. She helped Emma clear space at the small table, listened attentively as his daughter described her current school projects, and asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated genuine interest in 8-year-old's perspective on the world. Her mannerisms and speech patterns suggested education and social experience that seemed inconsistent with homelessness, but Alden had learned not to make assumptions about people's backgrounds or the circumstances that led to their current situations. Mia's knowledge base was surprisingly broad and deep, encompassing everything from automotive engineering to local history, to child development theory. When Emma struggled with a math problem involving fractions, Mia explained the concept using analogies to engine components that helped the girl understand proportional relationships in concrete terms. When Alden mentioned difficulties sourcing parts for a vintage Ford truck, Mia suggested suppliers and salvage yards that he hadn't heard of despite years in the business. Her familiarity with Phoenix geography and business networks suggested someone who had lived in the area for years rather than a transient individual passing through the city. But it was her interaction with Emma that most impressed and concerned Alden. Mia seemed to understand intuitively how to communicate with children, offering encouragement without condescension, setting gentle boundaries without being authoritarian, and showing interest in Emma's thoughts and feelings without prying into family matters. She helped with homework when asked but didn't insert herself into the father-daughter relationship, supported Alden's parenting decisions even when she might have handled situations differently, and gradually became a welcome presence in their daily routine without overstepping the invisible boundaries that protected their family unit. As the weeks passed, Mia began arriving earlier in the mornings and staying later in the evenings, though she always disappeared overnight to wherever she spent her sleeping hours. She never asked to use the bathroom facilities inside the shop, never requested favors beyond the food they freely offered, and never shared personal information that might create obligations or expectations. But her presence became a comforting constant in the rhythm of their days, someone who appreciated the satisfaction of honest work and understood the challenges of maintaining dignity while struggling with limited resources. Emma began saving interesting articles from her school library to share with Mia, excited to discuss books and ideas with an adult who took her opinions seriously and encouraged her intellectual curiosity. Alden found himself looking forward to their lunch conversations, which ranged from technical discussions about automotive innovation to philosophical debates about business ethics and community responsibility. Mia's insights were often surprisingly sophisticated, reflecting knowledge and experience that raised questions about her background and the circumstances that had led to her current situation. But it was during their fourth week of shared lunches that Alden began noticing details that didn't quite fit the profile of someone experiencing homelessness due to mental illness, addiction, or economic hardship. Mia's teeth were straight and well-maintained, suggesting recent dental care that required insurance or significant out-of-pocket expenses. Her skin showed signs of sun exposure, but not the kind of weathering that characterized people who had been living outdoors for extended periods. Her vocabulary and communication style reflected education and professional experience, while her knowledge of local business networks suggested connections that would typically lead to employment opportunities rather than street living. Most puzzling was her apparent familiarity with the neighborhood's recent development patterns and property values. She knew which buildings had recently changed ownership, which businesses were struggling with rising rents, and which properties were likely targets for future development. When Alden mentioned concerns about gentrification affecting his customer base, Mia's responses demonstrated understanding of real estate markets and urban planning that seemed far beyond what someone would acquire through casual observation or street-level experience. Her questions about the shop's operations were equally sophisticated, focusing on business model sustainability rather than simple curiosity about automotive repair. She asked about customer demographics, revenue patterns, competition from chain operations, and long-term planning in ways that suggested professional interest rather than casual conversation. When Alden discussed his challenges with equipment maintenance and facility upgrades, Mia offered suggestions that reflected knowledge of business financing and operational efficiency that seemed inconsistent with her apparent circumstances. But despite growing curiosity about Mia's background, Alden respected her privacy and avoided direct questions that might make her uncomfortable or defensive. Everyone had reasons for their circumstances, and he had learned that people shared personal information when they felt safe and ready, rather than when others demanded explanations. His focus remained on providing friendship and support without judgment, creating space where Mia could be herself without feeling pressured to justify her situation or reveal details she preferred to keep private. Emma, with the directness that children possessed before learning social conventions about sensitive topics, occasionally asked Mia questions about her living situation and future plans. But rather than being offended or evasive, Mia seemed to appreciate Emma's honest curiosity and answered in ways that satisfied the girl's need for understanding without providing details that might worry or confuse her. She explained that she was between permanent housing situations, that she enjoyed spending time outdoors, and that she was exploring different neighborhoods to learn about community dynamics and local culture. The relationship that developed between the three of them was unlike anything Alden had experienced since Rebecca's death. It wasn't romantic or familial in traditional senses, but it felt like genuine connection based on mutual respect and shared values. Mia brought perspectives and insights that enriched their daily conversations, while Emma's presence seemed to bring out protective and nurturing instincts in Mia that suggested experience with children and families. For Alden, it was the first time since becoming a widower that he had enjoyed regular adult conversation with someone who understood both his professional challenges and his commitment to single parenthood. But beneath the surface of comfortable routine, Alden sensed undercurrents of complexity that he couldn't quite identify or understand. Mia's presence in their lives felt both natural and somehow planned, as if she had chosen them specifically, rather than ending up in their alley by chance or circumstance. Her knowledge and insight seemed too comprehensive and current for someone who had been disconnected from mainstream society, while her interest in their lives and business felt deeper than casual friendship or temporary gratitude for kindness shown to a stranger in need. The first detail that struck Alden as inconsistent occurred during the 5th week of their lunch routine, when Mia arrived wearing different shoes than the worn sneakers she had been sporting since her first appearance in the alley. The new footwear was clearly expensive, high-end athletic shoes that probably cost more than Alden made in a good week, but they were scuffed and dirty in ways that suggested deliberate effort to make them appear used rather than wear patterns that developed naturally over time. When he mentioned noticing her new shoes, Mia explained that she had found them at a donation center, but her story felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The inconsistency bothered him more than it should have, creating a nagging sense that something about Mia's situation didn't align with the narrative he had constructed in his mind. People experiencing homelessness developed sophisticated networks for acquiring necessities, and finding quality donated items wasn't unusual or suspicious. But the shoes were current year models from a premium brand, hardly the type of merchandise that typically ended up in charity distribution centers, and they appeared to be exactly Mia's size rather than the close enough fit that characterized most donated clothing. Over the following days, Alden found himself paying closer attention to details that he had previously overlooked or dismissed as unimportant. Mia's backpack, which he had assumed contained her essential possessions, seemed unusually light for someone carrying everything they owned. Her clothes, while clearly worn and weathered, showed signs of quality construction and materials that suggested designer.
Her hygiene and grooming also raised questions that didn't have obvious answers. Despite living in an alley without apparent access to shower facilities, Mia maintained cleanliness standards that required regular washing and basic grooming supplies. Her hair was clean and styled in ways that suggested recent professional attention, while her fingernails were trimmed and maintained with a precision that indicated access to appropriate tools and private space for personal care. When he casually asked about restroom and washing facilities in the area, she provided detailed information about public resources that demonstrated familiarity with social services, but no apparent personal dependence on them. But it was her knowledge of the local business community that most puzzled and concerned Alden. During conversations about economic trends and neighborhood development, Mia displayed understanding of commercial real estate markets that went far beyond what someone would acquire through casual observation or general interest. She knew specific details about property ownership, lease agreements, development permits, and zoning regulations that required access to public records and professional databases. When he mentioned struggling with a rent increase notice from his landlord, she offered advice about tenant rights and negotiation strategies that reflected legal knowledge and business experience. Her familiarity with other business owners in the area was equally sophisticated and detailed. She knew which restaurants were struggling with health department violations, which retail establishments were behind on rent payments, and which service providers were considering relocation due to changing demographics. This information was specific and current, suggesting active monitoring rather than passive observation, and it implied connections within the business community that seemed inconsistent with her apparent social isolation. Emma, with the observational skills that children developed when they paid attention to adult behavior patterns, began asking questions that reflected her own growing awareness of inconsistencies in Mia's story. Why did Mia always seem to know exactly what time the shop closed each day, even though they had never discussed Alden's schedule? How did she manage to stay so clean when the public restrooms she claimed to use were frequently out of order or locked? Why did she never seem surprised by changes in weather patterns or local events, as if she had access to reliable information sources? Alden initially dismissed Emma's observations as childhood suspicion of anything that seemed different or unusual, but her questions highlighted patterns that he had noticed subconsciously without processing their implications. Mia's presence in their lives had become so comfortable and routine that he had stopped questioning the circumstances that brought her to their alley, or the resources that sustained her daily existence. But children often notice details that adults overlooked, especially when those details didn't match expected patterns or logical explanations. The breakthrough moment came during their 7th week of shared lunches, when Mia mentioned having read a newspaper article about proposed zoning changes that would affect automotive businesses in their district. The article had appeared in the business section of the Arizona Republic that morning, but when Alden checked the newspaper stand outside the Mexican restaurant next door, no copies had been purchased since the previous evening. The homeless shelter that Mia claimed to visit occasionally for resources didn't provide newspaper access, and the public library didn't open until after she had arrived at the alley that morning. When he asked where she had read the article, Mia's explanation about finding a discarded newspaper felt forced and defensive, quite different from her usual confident responses to questions about her daily activities. The story didn't make logical sense, but more importantly, her reaction to his question suggested awareness that she had made an error in revealing information she shouldn't have possessed. For the first time since meeting her, Alden sensed that Mia was carefully monitoring her words and constructing responses rather than simply sharing her thoughts and observations. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Alden found himself reviewing his interactions with Mia from a different perspective, looking for patterns and inconsistencies that might explain his growing sense of unease. The woman who had appeared in his alley claiming to be homeless possessed knowledge, resources, and connections that suggested a very different reality than the one she had presented. Her interest in his business and financial situation felt less like casual friendship and more like professional assessment, while her familiarity with local development patterns implied involvement in real estate markets, rather than mere observation from the margins. But what bothered him most was the realization that Emma had become emotionally attached to someone whose true identity and motivations remained completely unknown. His daughter looked forward to their daily conversations with Mia, shared personal information about her life and dreams, and had begun including this mysterious woman in her mental picture of their extended family. If Mia's presence in their lives was based on deception or hidden agendas, the eventual revelation could be devastating for a girl who had already experienced the sudden loss of her mother and learned to be cautious about trusting new relationships. The protective instincts that had guided Alden's decisions since becoming a single father demanded answers to questions he had been too polite or trusting to ask directly. Who was Mia really, and what did she want from them? Why had she chosen their alley and their shop for whatever purpose had brought her into their lives? And most importantly, what were her true intentions regarding Emma and the family unit they had worked so hard to rebuild after Rebecca's death? Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by questions and scenarios that ranged from innocent explanations to dangerous possibilities. By morning, Alden had decided that his responsibility as a father required him to investigate Mia's background and motivations, regardless of how uncomfortable that might make their relationship or how disappointed Emma might be if her new friend proved to be something other than what she appeared. The truth came to light on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered not through careful investigation or direct confrontation, but through an accidental encounter that shattered every assumption Alden had made about Mia's identity and circumstances. He had driven Emma to school early for a science fair setup, then stopped at the downtown Starbucks on Central Avenue to grab coffee before returning to the shop. The location was 20 blocks from his neighborhood, in the heart of Phoenix's business district, where glass towers housed corporate headquarters and luxury condominiums attracted young professionals with six-figure salaries. As he waited in line behind a group of lawyers discussing merger negotiations and voices loud enough to demonstrate their self-importance, Alden noticed a commotion near the front of the store that seemed to involve someone who looked remarkably familiar. The woman at the center of attention was clearly Mia, but transformed in ways that made him question his own recognition skills. Instead of worn jeans and a faded t-shirt, she wore an impeccably tailored business suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Her hair was professionally styled, her makeup was expertly applied, and she carried herself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect and attention. She was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with a man in his 50s, who treated her with the deference typically reserved for major clients or powerful executives. Their discussion involved financial figures and property addresses that Alden couldn't fully hear, but the tone and body language suggested business negotiations rather than casual conversation. When the man addressed her as Miss Thornton, and mentioned something about the downtown acquisition portfolio, Alden felt his understanding of reality shift in ways that left him disoriented and increasingly angry. Mia Thornton. The name meant nothing to him initially, but as he processed the implications of what he was witnessing, fragments of recent news stories began connecting in his memory. Thornton Development Group was one of Phoenix's most aggressive real estate companies, responsible for transforming entire neighborhoods through strategic property acquisition and redevelopment projects that displaced longtime residents and businesses in favor of upscale retail and luxury housing. The company's founder and CEO was a young woman who had inherited a real estate empire from her father and expanded it into a billion-dollar operation that specialized in identifying undervalued urban properties and converting them into maximum profit ventures. The homeless woman who had been eating lunch in his shop for 2 months, sharing stories with his daughter and offering advice about his business challenges, was actually Mia Thornton, one of the wealthiest and most powerful real estate developers in Arizona. The realization hit him like physical impact, creating a sensation of betrayal and humiliation that made it difficult to think clearly or rationally. Everything about their relationship had been based on deception, from her fabricated circumstances to her carefully constructed persona as someone struggling with homelessness and social isolation. But the implications went far beyond personal embarrassment or wounded feelings. If Mia Thornton had been spending weeks observing his business operations and asking detailed questions about his finances and customer base, her presence in his alley wasn't coincidental or charitable. She was conducting research, gathering intelligence about potential acquisition targets in a neighborhood that was clearly being considered for redevelopment. His kindness had been exploited as cover for corporate espionage, while Emma's innocent friendship had been manipulated as a source of inside information about their family's vulnerabilities and circumstances. As he watched Mia conclude her business meeting and walk toward the exit with the confident stride of someone who owned whatever space she occupied, Alden felt anger building in ways that reminded him of the rage he had experienced after Rebecca's death, when well-meaning friends offered platitudes about God's plan and everything happening for a reason. The difference was that Rebecca's death had been genuinely accidental, a random tragedy that couldn't be prevented or predicted. Mia's deception was deliberate and calculated, designed to extract information and access that she could use to destroy the life he had worked so hard to build for himself and Emma. But confronting her in public would accomplish nothing except creating a scene that might embarrass Emma when she inevitably learned about the situation. Instead, Alden followed Mia at a discreet distance as she walked 2 blocks to a gleaming office tower that housed Thornton Development Group's corporate headquarters. He watched from across the street as she entered the building with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged there, disappearing into an elevator that probably carried her to an executive suite overlooking the city she was systematically transforming according to her vision of profitable progress. The drive back to his shop felt like traveling through a landscape that had fundamentally changed overnight, even though nothing visible had actually shifted. The buildings and streets looked the same, but his understanding of his place within the larger economic ecosystem had been completely altered. He wasn't just a small business owner struggling to maintain independence in a competitive market. He was a target, identified and studied by one of the most sophisticated predators in the commercial real estate industry, someone with unlimited resources and no apparent moral constraints about using personal relationships to advance business objectives. The worst part was imagining how he would explain the situation to Emma, whose trust in adult reliability had already been damaged by her mother's sudden death. His daughter had formed a genuine emotional attachment to someone who viewed her as nothing more than a source of useful information, a pathway to intelligence about family finances and business vulnerabilities that could be exploited for profit. The betrayal would teach Emma lessons about human nature and the relationship between wealth and power that no 8-year-old should have to learn through personal experience. When he arrived back at the shop, Alden found Mia waiting in her usual spot in the alley, dressed once again in worn clothes and carrying the battered backpack that was apparently part of her disguise. She greeted him with the same warm smile that had become familiar over their weeks of shared lunches, asking about Emma's science fair preparation and mentioning an interesting article she had read about new automotive technologies. Her performance was flawless, displaying no awareness that her true identity had been discovered or that her deception was about to be exposed. But everything about the interaction felt different now that Alden understood the reality behind her carefully constructed facade. Her questions about his business weren't motivated by friendship or casual interest. Her suggestions about operational improvements weren't intended to help him succeed. Her kindness toward Emma wasn't genuine affection but calculated manipulation designed to maintain access to information that could be used against their family. Even her apparent homelessness, which had triggered his protective instincts and desire to help someone in need, was nothing more than an elaborate lie designed to exploit his compassion for strategic advantage. The confrontation, when it finally came, was inevitable and devastating in ways that neither of them had anticipated. As they sat in the shop's break room waiting for Emma to arrive from school, Alden's carefully controlled anger finally overwhelmed his commitment to maintaining polite pretenses. The words came out in a rush of accusation and disappointment that surprised him with their intensity and bitterness, revealing depths of betrayal that he hadn't fully processed until he heard himself speaking them aloud. "I know who you are, Mia Thornton," he said quietly, watching her face for signs of the reaction he expected. "I saw you this morning at Starbucks, meeting with your business associates and discussing acquisition portfolios. I know about Thornton Development Group and your billion-dollar real estate empire. So what I want to understand is why one of the wealthiest people in Arizona has been pretending to be homeless in my alley for the past 2 months." The transformation in Mia's expression was immediate and complete, shifting from surprised confusion to resigned acceptance in the space of a few seconds. The carefully constructed mask of vulnerability and gratitude fell away, replaced by the composed confidence of someone accustomed to being discovered and challenged. She leaned back in her chair with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of multiple deceptions finally coming to light, her posture shifting from defensive to explanatory as she prepared to reveal truths that would fundamentally alter their relationship. "You're absolutely right," she said simply, her voice taking on tones of authority and education that had been carefully suppressed during their previous conversations. "I am Mia Thornton, and I do own Thornton Development Group. But before you assume the worst about my motivations, I need you to understand why I've been conducting this experiment and what I discovered about you and Emma that changed everything I thought I knew about human nature and business ethics." The word experiment hit Alden like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about being studied and manipulated for purposes he couldn't fully comprehend. But there was something in Mia's tone that suggested complexity beyond simple corporate espionage, an emotional weight that implied personal stakes rather than merely professional objectives. Despite his anger and sense of betrayal, curiosity compelled him to listen as she began explaining the circumstances that had led to her elaborate deception. "6 months ago, my company completed a demographic analysis of this neighborhood as part of a potential redevelopment project," Mia continued, her words measured and precise. "The data indicated that most businesses were struggling financially and would likely welcome buyout offers that provided immediate capital in exchange for relocation assistance. But data doesn't capture character or community value, and I've learned that my company's reputation for aggressive acquisition tactics means people tell me what they think I want to hear rather than sharing their honest perspectives." She paused, studying Alden's face for signs of understanding or continued hostility before proceeding with explanations that revealed planning and research far more extensive than he had imagined. Her deception hadn't been spontaneous or casual, but part of a systematic effort to understand the human impact of redevelopment projects that she had begun questioning after years of focusing exclusively on financial returns and market efficiency. "I decided to spend time in neighborhoods targeted for development, observing how people actually lived and worked rather than relying on statistical analysis and consultant reports," Mia explained. "I wanted to understand what would be lost when communities were transformed, whether the social and economic disruption was justified by the supposed improvements we were creating. Your alley was convenient and provided good observation points, but I never intended to become personally involved with anyone or create genuine relationships." The admission that their friendship had been unplanned provided slight comfort, suggesting that Emma's emotional attachment hadn't been deliberately cultivated as part of some corporate strategy. But it also raised questions about what had changed Mia's original intentions and why she had allowed personal connections to develop when her stated purpose was objective observation rather than community engagement. "What I discovered challenged every assumption I had made about people in your economic circumstances," Mia continued, her voice carrying undertones of genuine respect and admiration. "Most business owners I've encountered during acquisition negotiations are focused entirely on maximizing their compensation packages and minimizing transition difficulties. But you were different. You shared food with someone you believed was homeless, not because you expected anything in return, but because you understood what it meant to struggle and wanted to help someone who had even less than you did." The praise felt manipulative and condescending, highlighting the vast economic inequality that separated their actual circumstances while suggesting that his kindness was somehow unusual or unexpected among people struggling with financial limitations. But there was something in Mia's expression that suggested genuine surprise and emotional impact rather than calculated flattery designed to manipulate his feelings or reduce his anger about being deceived. "Emma's acceptance of me was even more remarkable," Mia added, her voice softening with what appeared to be authentic affection. "She treated me like family from the very beginning, sharing her thoughts and dreams with someone she believed was experiencing homelessness and social isolation. Most children from privileged backgrounds are taught to be suspicious of people whose circumstances suggest instability or potential danger, but Emma saw need and responded with compassion, just like her father." The mention of Emma intensified Alden's protective anger, reminding him that his daughter's emotional well-being had been compromised by an adult's decision to maintain elaborate deceptions for corporate research purposes. Whatever Mia's motivations or discoveries, Emma had been harmed by forming attachments to someone whose true identity and intentions remained hidden until circumstances forced revelation of the truth. "None of that justifies lying to us for 2 months, Alden said firmly, his voice carrying the controlled intensity that he used when discussing serious matters with Emma. "You exploited our kindness and Emma's trust to gather information about our business and personal circumstances. You turned our home into a research site and our friendship into data collection. Whatever you learned about human nature, you violated basic principles of honesty and consent that should govern any meaningful relationship." Mia's response surprised him with its directness and apparent sincerity, suggesting emotional investment that went beyond professional curiosity or academic interest in social dynamics. The composed executive confidence that had characterized her initial revelation gave way to something that seemed more vulnerable and personally invested, as if the experiment had affected her as profoundly as it had affected them. "You're absolutely right about the ethical violations," she admitted, her voice carrying undertones of genuine regret. "I crossed boundaries that should never be crossed, and I used your kindness in ways that were manipulative and wrong. But what I learned changed not just my understanding of this community but my entire approach to business and social responsibility. I need you to understand that before you decide what happens next." The conversation that followed Mia's admission stretched late into the evening, continuing long after Emma had returned from school and been sent upstairs with homework and instructions not to disturb the adults who were having an important discussion. The weight of revelation hung between them like a physical presence, transforming every shared memory from the past 2 months into something that felt simultaneously genuine and fraudulent. Alden found himself caught between fury at being deceived and reluctant fascination with the complexity of motivations that had driven someone with unlimited resources to choose such an elaborate and risky method of community research. Mia's explanation revealed layers of corporate strategy and personal questioning that painted a picture far more nuanced than simple predatory business practices. Thornton Development Group had indeed identified their neighborhood as a prime candidate for redevelopment, but the project had stalled due to community resistance and negative publicity from previous acquisitions that had displaced longtime residents without adequate compensation or relocation assistance. The company's board of directors was pressuring her to move forward with aggressive tactics that would force property owners to sell regardless of their personal circumstances or community connections. "My father built this company using methods that were considered acceptable in his generation," Mia explained, her voice carrying undertones of conflict that suggested ongoing struggles with inherited business practices. "Buy low, develop fast, maximize profits, and don't worry about social impact because market forces would eventually benefit everyone through economic growth and job creation. But I've watched neighborhoods transform in ways that destroyed communities without creating equivalent value for the people who lived there first." The admission revealed internal corporate dynamics that Alden hadn't expected, suggesting that Mia's deception had been motivated partly by resistance to pressure from business partners and board members who viewed community concerns as obstacles to profitable development rather than legitimate stakeholder interests. Her decision to conduct personal research rather than relying on consultant reports and demographic data had been driven by growing discomfort with the human cost of aggressive redevelopment projects. "The board wants me to proceed with eminent domain proceedings and aggressive buyout tactics that would force everyone in a 6-block radius to sell within 90 days, she continued, her words delivered with the precise diction of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms but uncomfortable with the decisions being demanded. "They've hired legal firms and consulting companies that specialize in expediting property acquisition regardless of owner preferences or community impact. The project timeline calls for demolition to begin within 6 months. The timeline hit Alden like physical impact, transforming abstract concerns about gentrification into immediate threats to his family's survival and security. 6 months wasn't enough time to relocate his business, find alternative housing for Emma, or negotiate fair compensation for property that represented not just financial investment but years of emotional commitment to building something meaningful in their community. The shop wasn't just his source of income but Emma's home, the place where she had learned to feel safe and stable after her mother's death. But what I learned during these past 2 months changed everything, Mia said, her voice intensifying with conviction that seemed to surprise her as much as it impressed Alden. You and Emma represent exactly what my company's development projects destroy. Not just affordable housing or small businesses, but communities where people take care of each other, where children learn values that can't be purchased, where human connection matters more than economic efficiency. The praise felt simultaneously validating and patronizing, highlighting the vast economic inequality that separated their circumstances while suggesting that their way of life was somehow quaint or unusual rather than simply different from the privileged communities that Mia had grown up experiencing. But there was something in her expression that suggested genuine respect and emotional investment rather than calculated flattery designed to manipulate his feelings or reduce his anger about the deception. So what happens now? Alden asked, his voice carrying the careful control he used when discussing serious matters that might affect Emma's future. You've completed your research and learned that poor people are capable of kindness and community connection. Does that information change your company's development plans, or do you just proceed with demolition while feeling guilty about the human cost? The question struck at the heart of his skepticism about wealthy individuals who expressed concern for social justice while continuing to benefit from systems that created and maintained inequality. Mia's experiment had been fascinating from an academic perspective, but Emma needed housing stability and he needed business continuity regardless of whatever insights had been gained through deceptive community research. It means I'm going to fight the board's timeline and propose alternative development strategies that preserve community character while still meeting our investors' financial expectations, Mia replied, her words carrying determination that seemed to reflect recent decision-making rather than long-term planning. I want to create a model that proves profitable development can enhance communities rather than destroying them, but I need time to build coalition support and demonstrate economic viability. But even as she spoke about alternative approaches and community-preserving development, Alden could sense underlying tensions and pressures that suggested her idealistic vision would face significant resistance from business partners who viewed social responsibility as obstacle to profit maximization. The corporate world that had shaped her identity and provided her resources operated according to principles that prioritized shareholder returns over community welfare, and changing those fundamental priorities would require more than good intentions and experimental research. The first indication that Mia's corporate associates were growing impatient with delays and alternative proposals came 3 days after their confrontation, delivered in the form of a certified letter from Thornton Development Group's legal department. The document was professionally crafted but unmistakably threatening, informing Alden that his property had been identified as part of a planned redevelopment project and offering a buyout figure that was approximately 60% of fair market value with a 30-day response deadline. The letter's tone was courteous but inflexible, suggesting that acceptance of their offer was expected rather than negotiated, and that failure to respond within the specified timeframe would result in more aggressive acquisition tactics, including eminent domain proceedings and legal challenges to his business licensing and building permits. The signature belonged to Richard Hawthorne, Thornton Development Group's senior legal counsel, someone who apparently hadn't been informed about Mia's change of heart regarding community-preserving development strategies.
Emma noticed the change in her father's mood immediately, displaying the heightened sensitivity to adult anxiety that characterized children who had already experienced significant loss and learned to monitor their environment for signs of potential threats. Her questions about why he seemed worried and whether they would have to move again revealed fears that he had hoped to avoid triggering through his attempts to maintain normal routines and positive attitudes about their future stability. "Are we going to lose our home like when Mommy died?" she asked that evening, as they prepared dinner together, her voice carrying the controlled fear of someone who had learned that adults couldn't always protect the people they loved from circumstances beyond their control. "Is Mia's company going to make us leave, even though she's our friend now?"
The questions forced Alden to confront realities that he had been trying to process privately while maintaining Emma's sense of security and normalcy. His daughter needed honest information about their situation without being burdened with adult anxieties about corporate power and legal vulnerabilities that were beyond her ability to influence or understand. But she also deserved preparation for potential changes that might disrupt her life, regardless of his efforts to protect their current circumstances. "We might have to make some changes," he said carefully, choosing words that acknowledged uncertainty without creating panic. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together and make sure you have a safe place to live and good schools to attend. Some things are beyond our control, but our family and our love for each other will never change." The conversation continued over the following days, as additional pressures began mounting from sources that suggested coordinated efforts to accelerate the acquisition timeline, regardless of Mia's stated intentions to pursue community-preserving alternatives. A building inspector arrived unannounced to conduct what he described as a routine safety evaluation, but his focus on potential code violations and structural deficiencies seemed designed to create justification for condemnation proceedings, rather than genuine concern for occupant safety. The inspection revealed minor issues that had existed for years without creating problems, but which could now be classified as violations requiring expensive remediation that would strain Alden's already limited financial resources. The inspector's report, delivered within 24 hours of his visit, recommended immediate repairs to electrical systems, plumbing infrastructure, and structural elements that would cost more than the shop's annual revenue and effectively force closure during the renovation period. Similar pressure tactics were being applied to other business owners throughout the neighborhood, creating a coordinated campaign that seemed designed to overwhelm resistance through multiple simultaneous challenges that exceeded any individual's ability to respond effectively. The Mexican restaurant next door received notice that their business license was under review due to alleged health department violations. The laundromat was cited for environmental compliance issues related to water usage and chemical disposal. The convenience store across the street was informed that their lease would not be renewed due to planned parking lot improvements. The pattern suggested professional coordination rather than coincidental timing, indicating that Thornton Development Group's legal and consulting teams were implementing aggressive acquisition strategies, regardless of Mia's stated commitment to alternative approaches. The disconnect between her expressed intentions and her company's actual practices raised questions about her ability to control corporate operations, or whether her community research had been nothing more than elaborate preparation for more sophisticated manipulation tactics. But it was the personal surveillance that most clearly demonstrated the resources and ruthlessness that characterized corporate property acquisition when conducted without moral constraints or community accountability. Alden noticed the same vehicles parked on his street for multiple consecutive days, occupied by individuals who seemed to be monitoring his shop's operations and customer patterns. His phone calls were periodically interrupted by strange clicking sounds and brief delays that suggested electronic monitoring. Emma reported that strangers had approached her friends at school, asking questions about her family's financial situation and future plans. The escalation from legal pressure to personal intimidation crossed boundaries that transformed business disputes into threats against family safety and emotional well-being. Emma's growing awareness that adult strangers were taking unusual interest in her life created anxiety that affected her sleep patterns and school performance. While Alden found himself constantly checking locks and security measures that had previously seemed adequate for their neighborhood's crime levels. The breaking point came during their third week of mounting pressure, when Emma's teacher called to inform Alden that his daughter had been approached by a woman claiming to be conducting a survey about local families for a community development project. The woman had asked detailed questions about Emma's after-school routine, her father's work schedule, and their family's financial circumstances, using professional credentials and official-looking identification that had convinced school staff to permit the interaction. Emma became upset when the woman started asking about whether your family might be interested in relocating to better housing in a different neighborhood. The teacher explained, her voice carrying concern that suggested awareness of inappropriate boundary violations. She told the woman that she didn't want to move away from her friends and her home, and that strangers shouldn't be asking children about their family's private business. We've reported the incident to school administration and increased supervision during dismissal times. The targeting of Emma transformed Alden's anger from frustrated resistance to protective fury that demanded immediate action regardless of potential consequences. Someone had crossed the line from business pressure into personal intimidation that threatened his daughter's sense of safety and emotional stability. The tactics being employed against their family exceeded anything that could be justified by legitimate development needs or corporate profit margins. When Mia appeared in the alley that evening, dressed once again in her disguise of worn clothes and carrying the backpack that was part of her elaborate deception, Alden confronted her with evidence of the coordinated campaign that was systematically destroying their community's resistance to forced relocation. His words came out in a controlled rush of accusation and demand for accountability that reflected both personal betrayal and paternal protectiveness. "Your company is using intimidation tactics against Emma," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the deadly calm that preceded either violence or definitive action. "School surveillance, personal questions about our family, threats designed to make children feel unsafe in their own neighborhood. Whatever game you're playing with alternative development strategies, your legal team is implementing standard corporate terrorism against families who can't fight back." Mia's reaction was immediate and appeared genuinely shocked, suggesting that the escalation tactics were being conducted without her knowledge or approval by subordinates who were following established corporate protocols rather than her stated preferences for community-preserving approaches. But her surprise also revealed the limitations of her actual authority within the corporate structure and raised questions about her ability to prevent further escalation regardless of personal intentions. "That's not supposed to be happening," she said, her voice carrying anger that seemed directed toward her own organization rather than defensive resistance to his accusations. "I specifically instructed our legal team to suspend aggressive acquisition tactics while I developed alternative proposals for board consideration. Someone is operating outside my direct orders and using tactics that I explicitly prohibited." The admission that she couldn't control her own company's operations while claiming to offer protection and alternative solutions highlighted the complexity of corporate power structures and the difficulty of implementing ethical practices when financial pressures demanded results regardless of methods employed. Her good intentions were meaningless if subordinates could simply ignore her directives and proceed with established business practices that prioritized efficiency over community welfare. "Then stop them," Alden demanded, his protective instincts overwhelming any remaining sympathy for her internal corporate struggles. "Use whatever authority you have to call off the surveillance and intimidation before Emma gets hurt or traumatized by adult conflicts that she shouldn't have to experience. My daughter has already lost her mother. She doesn't need to lose her sense of safety because your company can't be controlled." The confrontation continued until well past Emma's bedtime, expanding beyond immediate tactical concerns to encompass fundamental questions about corporate responsibility and individual accountability that had no easy answers or immediate solutions. But by the end of their conversation, Mia had committed to using whatever influence she possessed to protect Emma from further targeting, while simultaneously developing strategies that might preserve their community without destroying her company's financial viability. The escalation that transformed their situation from business dispute to existential crisis came exactly 48 hours after Mia's promise to intervene on their behalf. Delivered with the surgical precision of professionals who specialized in eliminating resistance through overwhelming force rather than negotiated settlement. Alden arrived at his shop that Thursday morning to find official notices posted on every door and window, documents that transformed his property from family business into condemned structure scheduled for immediate demolition. The condemnation order cited structural deficiencies identified during the recent inspection, environmental hazards requiring expensive remediation, and zoning violations that made continued operation illegal until compliance issues were resolved according to specifications that would cost more than the property's assessed value. The timeline for response was 14 days, during which all business operations must cease and the building must be vacated pending either compliance with remediation requirements or voluntary demolition to prevent public safety hazards. But the condemnation was only the beginning of a coordinated assault that demonstrated resources and planning that went far beyond normal business acquisition tactics. Emma's school called before 9 o'clock to inform Alden that his daughter's enrollment was being questioned due to residency requirements that apparently no longer recognized their apartment as valid housing. The state licensing board for automotive repair facilities had initiated an investigation into his business practices based on anonymous complaints about environmental compliance and customer fraud. His bank had frozen his business accounts pending review of financial irregularities that allegedly suggested money laundering or tax evasion. Each challenge individually might have been manageable through legal representation and bureaucratic persistence, but the simultaneous timing created impossible demands that exceeded any individual's capacity to respond effectively while maintaining business operations or family stability. The strategy was clearly designed to overwhelm resistance through multiple simultaneous crises that would force acceptance of buyout terms regardless of personal preferences or community connections. Emma's reaction to the crisis was heartbreaking in ways that reminded Alden of her response to her mother's death, when she had tried to maintain normal routines while processing losses that exceeded her emotional capacity to understand or accept. She packed her school supplies methodically while asking practical questions about where they would live and whether she would have to change schools, displaying the forced maturity that children developed when adult problems invaded their previously protected world. "Will we still be able to see Mia if we have to move?" she asked, while organizing her art supplies into boxes that might need to be stored indefinitely. "She promised to help me with my science project about community helpers, and I want to show her the drawing I made of her reading in the alley before we knew she was really a business lady." The question highlighted the complexity of relationships that had developed under false pretenses but generated genuine emotional attachments that would be painful to sever regardless of the deception involved. Emma's friendship with Mia had been based on fabricated circumstances, but her feelings were real and her sense of loss would be authentic when that relationship inevitably ended due to circumstances beyond her control. Alden's response was interrupted by a phone call that transformed concern into immediate danger, delivered by Danny Rodriguez, his old friend from the fire department, who now worked in law enforcement and occasionally provided informal information about situations that might affect community safety. Danny's voice carried urgency that suggested official rather than casual interest in their conversation. "You need to know that Thornton Development Group has hired Blackstone Security for property protection services in your neighborhood," Danny said without preamble, his words carrying implications that chilled Alden's blood. Blackstone specializes in corporate intimidation and forced relocation tactics that have resulted in multiple lawsuits and at least 2 suspicious accidents involving property owners who refused buyout offers. Blackstone Security was notorious throughout Arizona for aggressive tactics that pushed legal boundaries while maintaining plausible deniability about criminal activities that couldn't be proven in court. Their operatives were typically former military or law enforcement personnel who understood how to apply pressure without creating evidence that could support criminal charges or civil liability claims. Their involvement suggested that Thornton Development Group was prepared to use violence, if necessary, to eliminate resistance to their acquisition timeline. "They've established a staging area in the abandoned warehouse 3 blocks from your shop," Danny continued, his voice carrying professional concern for civilian safety. "Surveillance equipment, communication systems, and vehicles that aren't registered to any legitimate business entity. This isn't normal property acquisition support. This is preparation for operations that local law enforcement won't be able to prevent or investigate effectively. The information confirmed Alden's worst fears about escalation while simultaneously providing crucial intelligence that might enable protective measures for Emma's safety. But it also highlighted his complete lack of resources to compete with corporate adversaries who possessed unlimited funding and professional expertise in elimination of obstacles to profitable development projects. Get Emma somewhere safe and keep her there until this situation resolves, Danny advised with the directness of someone who had seen corporate intimidation tactics escalate into genuine violence. Document everything, but don't try to fight them directly. Blackstone doesn't lose confrontations with civilians, and your daughter needs a living father more than you need to prove principles about community resistance. The advice was both practical and devastating, acknowledging that protection of family required abandonment of everything he had worked to build while accepting defeat by adversaries who viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in pursuit of profit maximization. But Emma's safety had to take priority over business survival or community loyalty, regardless of personal cost or moral implications. The conversation with Danny was followed immediately by a call from Mia, her voice carrying panic and urgency that suggested she had finally discovered the extent of operations being conducted without her knowledge or approval. Her company's board of directors had apparently voted to accelerate the acquisition timeline, using whatever methods proved necessary, overruling her objections and removing her from direct operation. They've hired private security contractors and legal firms that specialize in forced property acquisition, she said, her words coming in rapid bursts that suggested she was moving while talking. I tried to stop the escalation, but the board has decided that my community research was a waste of time and resources that threatened investor confidence. They're implementing standard aggressive tactics regardless of community impact or individual circumstances. The admission that she had lost control of her own company's operations while claiming to offer protection and alternative solutions revealed the fundamental powerlessness of individual conscience when confronted with institutional priorities that valued profit over human welfare. Her good intentions were meaningless if she couldn't prevent subordinates from implementing tactics that threatened Emma's safety and destroyed their family's stability. I'm coming to get you and Emma right now, Mia continued, her voice carrying determination that seemed driven by personal responsibility rather than corporate obligation. My lawyers are preparing injunctions and media statements that might slow down the legal proceedings, but Blackstone Security operates outside normal legal constraints. You need to be somewhere safe while we figure out how to fight this properly. But even as she offered protection and resources, Alden could sense the limitations of her actual power to prevent escalation by adversaries who possessed both legal authority and willingness to use violence when economic pressure proved insufficient. The corporate machine that had created her wealth was now operating beyond her control, implementing practices that she claimed to oppose but couldn't effectively prevent. The decision point that had been building since Mia's initial deception finally crystallized into immediate action requirements that would determine not just their family's future, but Emma's physical safety and emotional well-being. Alden could accept defeat and relocate his family to protect Emma from escalating corporate intimidation, or he could choose to fight adversaries who possessed vastly superior resources and demonstrated willingness to harm innocent people who interfered with profitable development projects. But there was a third option that neither submission nor hopeless resistance, a possibility that had emerged from weeks of conversation with someone whose understanding of corporate operations might provide strategic advantages that individual resistance couldn't achieve alone. If Mia possessed both insider knowledge and genuine commitment to alternative outcomes, their combined resources might create opportunities that neither could accomplish independently. No, Alden said firmly, his voice carrying determination that surprised him with its clarity and conviction. We're not running away, and we're not fighting them on their terms. If you really want to prove that your research changed your perspective on community development, then help me expose what they're doing to the media and regulatory agencies that can hold them accountable for illegal intimidation tactics. The proposal represented a fundamental shift from defensive reaction to strategic counterattack, using Mia's insider knowledge and corporate connections to transform their struggle from individual resistance into public accountability that could protect not just their family but other community members facing similar pressures. It was dangerous and probably desperate, but it offered the possibility of victory rather than mere survival. They have unlimited resources and professional expertise, Mia protested, her voice carrying concern that seemed focused on his safety rather than her own corporate interests. Blackstone Security has successfully eliminated dozens of property owners who tried to resist forced acquisition. Even with media attention and legal challenges, they might decide that eliminating key witnesses is worth the risk of criminal investigation. But Alden had spent years responding to emergencies that required quick decisions under extreme pressure, and his instincts told him that retreat would only postpone rather than prevent eventual defeat by adversaries who viewed community resistance as temporary obstacle to profitable development. Emma needed to learn that some battles were worth fighting regardless of odds, and that adults had responsibilities to protect not just their own families, but entire communities threatened by institutional power that operated without moral constraints. Then we make sure the cost of eliminating witnesses exceeds any possible benefit they might gain, he replied, his voice carrying the calm determination that had once enabled him to run toward burning buildings while others fled to safety. We document everything, involve every media outlet and regulatory agency that might care about corporate intimidation tactics, and make sure that harming us creates more problems than leaving us alone. The plan that began forming in their conversation represented the kind of desperate strategy that emerged when conventional options had been exhausted and survival required creativity rather than superior resources. They would use Mia's corporate knowledge and connections to expose Thornton Development Group's illegal tactics, while simultaneously building coalition support among other affected property owners and community advocates who shared interest in preventing forced displacement. It was dangerous, probably illegal in some aspects, and almost certainly doomed to failure against adversaries who possessed both unlimited funding and willingness to use violence. But it was also the only option that offered hope for protecting Emma's future while maintaining dignity and community connections that gave their lives meaning beyond mere survival. As evening fell over Phoenix and streetlights began illuminating the neighborhood that had become their battleground, Alden looked at Emma coloring quietly at the small table in their apartment and realized that some decisions made themselves when the alternative was abandoning everything that mattered most. They would fight, not because victory was likely, but because some principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost. The transformation from desperate resistance to strategic counterattack began in the basement of St. Michael's Catholic Church, chosen for their first planning meeting because its historical designation provided some protection from electronic surveillance, and its community conditions offered access to networks that crossed economic and political boundaries. Father Martinez, who had served the neighborhood for 30 years and witnessed multiple cycles of development pressure, opened the church facilities to what he diplomatically described as a community discussion about preserving local character during periods of economic change. The initial gathering included 12 property owners who had received similar condemnation notices or buyout offers, 3 small business operators facing licensing challenges that coincided suspiciously with development timeline pressure, 2 journalists from local media outlets who specialized in investigating corporate abuse of eminent domain proceedings, and Maria Santos, a community organizer who had successfully challenged previous development projects through coalition building and media exposure. Mia's presence at the meeting created initial tension and suspicion among community members who viewed her as the primary source of their problems, rather than potential ally in resistance effort. Her expensive clothes had been replaced with modest casual wear, but her behavior and speech patterns still reflected privileged background that separated her from neighbors who were struggling with economic pressures that she had never personally experienced. Before we discuss strategy, Maria said diplomatically but firmly, we need to understand why someone whose company is destroying our community wants to help us fight against her own financial interests. Trust has to be earned through actions, not promises, and we've all learned to be suspicious of wealthy people who claim to care about poor neighborhoods when their money comes from exploiting those same communities. The challenge was direct and legitimate, forcing Mia to articulate motivations that went beyond guilt or public relations concerns to demonstrate genuine commitment to outcomes that might cost her personally and professionally. Her response surprised the group with its honesty about corporate operations and her willingness to provide insider information that could be used against her own company's interests. My research showed me that communities like this would create social value that can't be measured in financial terms or replaced through development projects, she began, her voice carrying sincerity that gradually reduced the hostility in the room. But more importantly, I discovered that my company's standard acquisition tactics include illegal intimidation, fraudulent safety violations, and coercion with private security firms that have histories of violence against civilians who resist displacement. She opened a briefcase containing documents that she claimed represented internal corporate communications about the redevelopment project, including emails that discussed elimination of property owner resistance through escalated pressure tactics and contracts with Blackstone Security that specified complete neighborhoods clears within 60 days, using all necessary methods. The documentation provided evidence of conspiracy and criminal intent that could support both media exposure and law enforcement investigation. I'm willing to testify against my own company, provide whatever evidence you need to stop this project. Mia continued, her words carrying conviction that seemed to reflect recent decision-making rather than long-term planning. But I need you to understand that fighting Thornton Development Group will require more than individual resistance or even community organizing. They have relationships with city council members, county commissioners, and state legislators who depend on their political contributions. We need federal intervention and media attention that reaches beyond local jurisdictions they've already compromised. The revelation that political corruption extended through local government explained why previous community resistance efforts had failed despite legitimate legal challenges and documented violations of property rights. But it also suggested that effective opposition would require resources and connections that exceeded anything their neighborhoods' coalition could realistically assemble through traditional organizing methods. Alden's contribution to strategy development drew from his experience with emergency response coordination, where successful outcomes required rapid information sharing, clear command structures, and contingency planning that anticipated multiple failure scenarios. His background in firefighting had taught him that overwhelming threats could sometimes be managed through strategic positioning rather than superior force, creating situations where adversary strengths became liabilities. We need to make this too expensive and too public for them to continue, he said steadily.
But it was Emma's innocent suggestion during dinner the following evening that provided the breakthrough insight that transformed their resistance strategy from defensive reaction to offensive operation capable of achieving complete victory. As Alden explained the basics of their situation in terms that an 8-year-old could understand, Emma asked why they couldn't simply tell everyone about what Mia's company was doing and let people decide whether they wanted businesses like that in their community. What if we made a movie about it?
She suggested with the straightforward logic that children applied to problems before learning that adult complications made simple solutions impossible, like a documentary that shows how they're being mean to families and trying to make people leave their homes. Then everyone would know what they're really like, and wouldn't want to shop at their buildings or work for their company. The suggestion sparked recognition of possibilities that none of the adults had considered, transforming their focus from defensive legal challenges to offensive public relations campaigns that could damage Thornton Development Group's reputation and business relationships throughout Arizona. Corporate intimidation tactics were effective, partly because they operated in secrecy, targeting individual property owners who lacked resources to fight back or attract media attention to their struggles. But systematic documentation of illegal tactics, combined with testimonies from multiple victims and insider evidence provided by Mia, could create multimedia presentations that would make Thornton Development Group's practices visible to potential customers, business partners, and political allies whose support depended on maintaining public images as ethical corporate citizens. The documentary project began with basic equipment borrowed from Emma's school media center and expanded rapidly as word spread through networks of community advocates, investigative journalists, and social media activists who specialized in exposing corporate abuse of vulnerable populations. Within a week, their informal coalition had grown to include professional videographers, legal experts who specialized in property rights cases, and political activists who understood how to use media attention to pressure elected officials into taking public stands on controversial issues. Mia's insider knowledge proved invaluable in identifying targets and timing that would maximize impact while minimizing legal exposure for coalition members who could be vulnerable to retaliation through frivolous lawsuits or regulatory harassment. Her access to internal corporate communications enabled prediction of Thornton Development Group's next tactical moves, while her understanding of board dynamics suggested pressure points that might force reconsideration of aggressive acquisition strategies. The board meeting next Tuesday will include presentations about the project timeline and community resistance levels, she explained during one of their evening planning sessions. If we can demonstrate that community opposition has generated significant media attention and political scrutiny, some board members might vote to suspend Blackstone Securities' contract and return to conventional negotiation approaches. But even as they developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for media manipulation and political pressure, the immediate threat to Emma's safety remained constant and escalating. Surveillance of their apartment had intensified to include obvious monitoring that seemed designed to create awareness of being watched rather than gathering intelligence discreetly. Strange vehicles parked outside Emma's school during dismissal times, and twice she had been approached by adults asking questions about her family's activities and future plans. The psychological pressure was taking visible toll on Emma's emotional well-being and school performance, creating sleep disturbances and anxiety symptoms that reminded Alden of her reaction to her mother's death. His daughter needed stability and normalcy, but their situation demanded constant vigilance and preparation for potential violence that might erupt without warning if their resistance efforts proved more effective than Thornton Development Group's patience could tolerate. The breakthrough that shifted momentum in their favor came from an unexpected source that demonstrated how community networks could provide resources and protection that individual resistance couldn't achieve alone. Rosa Martinez, the owner of the Mexican restaurant next door, had been quietly documenting harassment that her business had experienced since receiving eviction notices, including photographs of suspicious individuals conducting surveillance and audio recordings of phone calls that contained barely veiled threats about compliance with relocation demands. But Rosa's most valuable contribution was her connection to Manuel Rodriguez, her nephew who worked as an investigative producer for Univision and had been looking for stories about corporate displacement of Latino communities throughout the Southwest. Manuel's interest in their situation represented access to media platforms that reached millions of viewers and political influence that extended far beyond local jurisdictions that Thornton Development Group might have already compromised through political contributions and business relationships.
This isn't just about your neighborhood, Manuel explained during their first interview session. Thornton Development Group is implementing similar tactics in communities throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. If we can document their pattern of illegal intimidation and forced displacement, it becomes a federal story that could trigger congressional investigations and Department of Justice intervention. The expansion of scope from local property dispute to regional investigation of systematic corporate abuse transformed their resistance efforts from desperate community organizing to potentially career-making journalism that attracted additional resources and expertise from media outlets and advocacy organizations that specialized in holding powerful corporations accountable for illegal business practices. Within 2 weeks of Manuel's involvement, their coalition had grown to include property rights lawyers who worked pro bono for cases that offered precedent-setting potential, former FBI agents who specialized in investigating corporate conspiracy, and political activists who understood how to coordinate media timing with legislative calendars to maximize pressure on elected officials who depended on public support for re-election. The documentation process revealed patterns of systematic abuse that exceeded even Mia's knowledge of her company's operations, suggesting that Thornton Development Group's aggressive tactics were more extensive and criminal than she had realized. Similar communities throughout the region had experienced identical sequences of building inspections that discovered previously unknown violations, licensing challenges that threatened business operations, and surveillance by private security firms that specialized in intimidation rather than legitimate protection services. But it was the discovery of coordination between Thornton Development Group and local government officials that provided evidence of corruption serious enough to attract federal prosecution interest. Email communications obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed discussions between company executives and city council members about expediting permit approvals and zoning changes in exchange for campaign contributions and consulting contracts that appeared to violate multiple state and federal laws regarding political corruption. As their evidence compilation neared completion and media attention intensified, Alden found himself caught between growing optimism about potential victory and persistent fear about retaliation that might target Emma before their exposure efforts could provide protection through public visibility. The next phase of their strategy would require going public with accusations that could destroy careers and trigger criminal investigations, creating level of risk that exceeded anything his family had previously faced. The final planning meeting took place in Rosa's restaurant after closing time, with security measures that included electronic jamming equipment borrowed from Manuel's media contacts and counter-surveillance techniques that Father Martinez had learned during his previous work as a military chaplain. The atmosphere combined anticipation of potential victory with awareness that their next actions would either achieve complete success or trigger retaliation that could prove devastating for everyone involved. "Tomorrow we release everything simultaneously," Maria announced, reviewing distribution lists that included national media outlets, federal agencies, and political offices throughout the Southwest. Documentation of illegal tactics, testimony from multiple victims, insider evidence of conspiracy, and proof of political corruption. Once this information becomes public, Thornton Development Group won't be able to retaliate against individual community members without creating additional evidence of criminal intimidation. As the meeting concluded and participants dispersed to their homes through carefully planned routes that avoided known surveillance positions, Alden realized that their family's future would be determined within the next 48 hours. They had built something unprecedented through community organizing and media coordination. But success would ultimately depend on whether their evidence was compelling enough to trigger protective intervention by authorities who possessed power to hold corporations accountable for criminal abuse of vulnerable populations. The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming as he climbed the stairs to their apartment, where Emma waited with homework and bedtime stories that represented normalcy in a world that had become increasingly dangerous and uncertain.
Tomorrow would bring either vindication of their resistance efforts or escalation of threats that might force them into permanent exile from the community they had fought so hard to protect. But as he tucked Emma into bed and listened to her prayers that included wishes for Mia's safety and hope that their neighborhood friends wouldn't have to move away, Alden understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of personal cost. They had chosen courage over surrender, community solidarity over individual survival, and truth over comfortable deception. Whatever happened next, they would face it together with dignity intact and principles uncompromised. The coordinated media release began at exactly 6 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, timed to coincide with national news cycles and designed to create maximum impact before Thornton Development Group's legal team could implement damage control strategies. Manuel Rodriguez's investigative report aired simultaneously on Univision's morning program and their national affiliate network, while digital versions appeared on social media platforms and news websites throughout the Southwest region. The documentation was devastating in its comprehensiveness and impossible to dismiss as isolated complaints from disgruntled property owners. Video testimonies from 12 families across 4 states described identical patterns of harassment, fraudulent building violations, and intimidation by private security contractors who used threats of violence to accelerate forced relocations. Internal corporate emails provided by Mia revealed explicit instructions to eliminate community resistance through escalated pressure tactics and budget allocations for enhanced persuasion services that clearly referred to illegal intimidation methods. But the evidence that created immediate federal interest was the proof of coordination between Thornton Development Group and elected officials who had received substantial campaign contributions in exchange for expedited permit approvals and zoning modifications that violated multiple state and federal laws. The documentation included audio recordings of phone conversations where city council members discussed specific vote timing in relation to political donation schedules, creating clear evidence of quid pro quo corruption that demanded federal prosecution response. Within 2 hours of the initial broadcast, Alden's phone was ringing constantly with calls from national media outlets, federal agencies, and political offices that wanted additional information about the systematic abuse patterns that the investigation had revealed. The Phoenix FBI field office dispatched agents to conduct formal interviews with community members who had experienced intimidation, while the Department of Justice announced that they were opening an investigation into potential civil rights violations and racketeering charges that could result in criminal prosecution of corporate executives. The response from Thornton Development Group was swift and revealed the panic that had consumed their corporate leadership when years of carefully concealed criminal activities suddenly became public knowledge that threatened both financial assets and personal freedom. Richard Hawthorne, the senior legal counsel who had signed the aggressive acquisition notices, appeared at an emergency press conference to announce that the company was immediately suspending all redevelopment activities in affected neighborhoods pending clarification of community concerns and regulatory requirements. But the damage to their corporate reputation extended far beyond the Phoenix project, as media attention revealed similar patterns of abuse in dozens of communities where Thornton Development Group had conducted business over the previous decade. Stock prices fell precipitously as investors realized that the company faced potential civil and criminal liability that could exceed their total assets, while business partners began terminating contracts to avoid association with criminal enterprise investigations. The most satisfying moment of vindication came when Alden watched television coverage of federal agents executing search warrants at Thornton Development Group's corporate headquarters, removing boxes of documents and computer equipment that would provide additional evidence for prosecution of criminal conspiracy charges. The executives who had authorized intimidation tactics against Emma and other innocent family members were now facing potential prison sentences that reflected the serious nature of their systematic abuse of vulnerable communities. Mia's cooperation with federal investigators proved crucial in securing prosecution outcomes that went beyond mere financial penalties to include personal accountability for individuals who had implemented and authorized criminal tactics. Her insider testimony provided evidence of intent and planning that transformed corporate abuse from civil violations into criminal conspiracy charges that carried substantial prison sentences and permanent prohibition from real estate development activities. "I never thought I would testify against my own company," she said during one of their evening conversations as the investigation expanded to include additional corporate partners and political allies who had participated in the corruption network. "But watching what they were willing to do to Emma and other innocent people made me realize that some business practices are simply criminal regardless of profit margins or investor expectations." The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed, driven by media attention and federal prosecutors who recognized career-making opportunities in cases that involved systematic corporate abuse of vulnerable populations. Within 6 months, 12 Thornton Development Group executives had been indicted on federal charges including conspiracy, racketeering, civil rights violations, and corruption of public officials. The company itself was dissolved, its assets liquidated to provide compensation for communities that had been damaged by their illegal tactics. But the most meaningful victory was the transformation of their neighborhood from targeted community into protected area that became a model for how resident organizing could successfully challenge corporate abuse when supported by media attention and federal intervention. The publicity had attracted new businesses and residents who were specifically interested in supporting communities that had demonstrated courage in defending their values against powerful adversaries. Emma's role in inspiring the documentary strategy that proved crucial to their success made her something of a local celebrity, with media outlets describing her as the 8-year-old who helped bring down a corporate empire through simple questions about fairness and community protection. But she handled the attention with characteristic grace, focusing on how their experience had taught her that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they worked together and refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The financial compensation that Alden received through the federal civil rights settlement provided resources to expand his auto repair business and establish the kind of stability that Emma needed for her education and emotional development. But more importantly, the experience had connected their family to community networks and advocacy organizations that would provide ongoing support and friendship that extended far beyond their immediate neighborhood. Mia's transformation from corporate predator to community advocate represented the most dramatic personal change that emerged from their conflict, though her journey toward redemption required years of consistent action rather than mere expressions of regret about past business practices. She used her remaining wealth to establish a foundation that provided legal assistance to communities facing corporate intimidation, while working with federal agencies to identify and investigate other companies that used similar abuse tactics. The relationship that developed between Alden, Emma, and Mia evolved gradually from adversarial confrontation to cautious cooperation to genuine friendship that was based on shared commitment to community protection rather than romantic attraction or economic dependency. Emma's initial hurt about the deception was balanced by appreciation for Mia's willingness to sacrifice her corporate interests to protect their family and neighborhood, while Alden came to respect her courage in testifying against former business partners who had the resources and motivation to make her life very difficult. The public attention that their story attracted led to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that allowed Alden to share their organizing strategies with other communities facing similar threats, while Emma's perspective on community resistance became part of school curricula that taught young people about civic engagement and social justice advocacy. Their experience demonstrated that corporate power, no matter how vast or ruthless, could be challenged successfully by ordinary people who possessed courage, creativity, and willingness to work together for common goals. The neighborhood itself became a destination for journalists, researchers, and activists who wanted to understand how successful community resistance could be organized and sustained against overwhelming corporate opposition. The publicity attracted new residents and businesses that were specifically committed to supporting communities that had demonstrated willingness to defend their values, creating economic development that enhanced rather than displaced existing community character. As federal prosecutions concluded and media attention gradually shifted to other stories, Alden found himself reflecting on how much their lives had changed since that first morning when he had offered a sandwich to someone he believed was experiencing homelessness. The simple act of kindness had led to deception and betrayal, but ultimately to victory and transformation that exceeded anything he could have imagined when their crisis began. The lessons that Emma learned from their experience would shape her understanding of justice, community responsibility, and individual agency in ways that no classroom education could provide. She had witnessed firsthand how ordinary people could challenge powerful institutions, how truth could triumph over deception, and how communities could protect their most vulnerable members when they worked together with courage and determination. Standing in his expanded auto repair shop on a quiet Sunday evening, watching Emma complete homework while Mia helped organize community meeting materials for the following week, Alden understood that some victories created lasting change that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. They had not just saved their neighborhood but had created a model for community resistance that would inspire and assist other families facing similar threats in the future. 2 years after the federal prosecutions concluded and media attention shifted to other stories, Alden stood in the doorway of what had once been his struggle auto repair shop and marveled at the transformation that community organizing and unexpected partnerships could create. The building still housed Finch Automotive Repair, but it had expanded to include the Neighborhood Justice Center, a legal aid clinic that provided free assistance to families facing corporate intimidation, and the Community Media Lab, where residents learned documentary production techniques that could expose abuse and hold powerful institutions accountable. Emma, now 10 years old and displaying leadership qualities that reminded everyone of her pivotal role in inspiring their resistance strategy, had become the unofficial ambassador for what journalists called the Phoenix model of community organizing. Her articulate explanations of how ordinary families could challenge corporate power attracted visitors from universities, advocacy organizations, and communities throughout the country that were facing similar threats from aggressive development companies. The most important thing we learned, she would tell visitors with the confident delivery of someone who had experienced victory against impossible odds, is that sharing what you have with people who need help can change everything. When my dad gave Mia sandwiches, he didn't know she was rich and testing people. But his kindness was real, and that's what made her want to help us fight the bad guys who were trying to steal our homes. Her perspective on their experience emphasized values rather than tactics, focusing on how compassion and community solidarity had created the foundation for successful resistance that went far beyond legal strategies or media manipulation. Emma understood intuitively that their victory had emerged from human connection rather than superior resources, and that lesson shaped her approach to the advocacy work she was already beginning to embrace as her future calling. Mia's transformation from corporate predator to community advocate had required years of consistent action to earn trust from neighbors who had legitimate reasons to remain suspicious of her motivations and commitment. But her establishment of the Community Protection Foundation, which provided legal representation and organizing support to families facing forced displacement, had demonstrated genuine dedication to values that went far beyond guilt about past business practices. I spent 15 years measuring success through profit margins and market dominance, she reflected during one of their regular evening conversations at Rose's restaurant, which had become the unofficial headquarters for their ongoing advocacy work. But watching Emma's courage and Alden's willingness to risk everything for principle taught me that real success means protecting people who can't protect themselves and creating communities where everyone has dignity and opportunity. Her foundation had successfully challenged corporate abuse in 37 communities across 12 states using documentation techniques and media strategies that had evolved from their original Phoenix campaign. But more importantly, she had discovered that using wealth to empower vulnerable populations provided satisfaction and purpose that exceeded anything she had experienced during her years of aggressive property development. The romantic relationship that eventually developed between Alden and Mia emerged slowly and naturally from shared work rather than dramatic revelation or emotional crisis. Their partnership was built on mutual respect, common values, and genuine affection that had grown through months of collaboration on projects that mattered to both of them. Emma's enthusiastic approval of their relationship reflected her understanding that families could grow and change in positive ways that honored rather than replaced precious memories. Their wedding, held in the community garden that had been established on land previously targeted for corporate development, attracted hundreds of neighbors, advocates, and journalists who had followed their story from desperate resistance to triumphant transformation. Emma served as maid of honor, delivering a speech about love, community, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they chose courage over comfort. The auto repair business had evolved into a community enterprise that provided automotive training for young adults aging out of foster care, employment opportunities for formerly incarcerated individuals who needed second chances, and mechanical services at affordable prices for working families who couldn't afford dealership rates. Alden's technical expertise combined with Mia's business knowledge and Emma's natural leadership abilities created an operation that demonstrated how social responsibility and financial sustainability could coexist successfully. But the most meaningful measure of their success was visible in the neighborhood itself, which had become a destination for families who specifically wanted to live in communities that had demonstrated commitment to mutual support and social justice. Property values had increased substantially, but through community-controlled development that prioritized affordable housing and local business ownership rather than displacement and gentrification. The evening routine in their expanded family reflected the same values that had sustained them through their original crisis, with dinner conversations that included discussion of current advocacy projects, Emma's school activities, and planning for community events that strengthened neighborhood connections. Their home remained above the shop, but with additional space for the family meetings and strategy sessions that had become regular parts of their community leadership responsibility. As autumn settled over Phoenix and streetlights illuminated sidewalks where children played safely, while their parents worked late in family businesses that were protected by community solidarity rather than corporate security, Alden realized that their simple act of sharing lunch had created ripple effects that would continue, expanding for generations. They had learned that kindness was not weakness, that justice was possible even against overwhelming odds, and that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to care for each other rather than protecting only themselves. Emma's latest school project, a documentary about communities that had successfully resisted corporate intimidation, would be shared with advocacy organizations throughout the country as an educational resource for families facing similar challenges. Her work represented the continuation of values and techniques that had emerged from their experience, ensuring that their victory would inspire and assist future generations who would inevitably face their own battle against institutional power that prioritized profit over human dignity. The story that had begun with mysterious circumstances and deceptive relationships had evolved into lasting transformation that proved the revolutionary potential of simple human kindness when combined with courage, community solidarity, and
an unwavering commitment to justice for all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.